The Australian Financial Review.
To get ahead, do you need a career plan?
I applaud people who sort of actively manage their careers. You know, folks who have a good sense of the market, a good sense of where they fit and how they would be valued in the external market. I've never really done that. You know, when someone says, what's your career plan? I've never really had one. I've very much sort of done the job in front of me and had my eyes open as to where I might learn more.
Welcome to 15 Minutes with the Boss, a podcast about success, failure, and all the lessons learned along the way. I'm your host, Sally Patton, and my guest today is Steve Hasker, the President and Chief Executive of Thomson Reuters, a global technology and information company that owns the Reuters news agency and provides data and insights to the legal, tax, risk and accounting sectors. Thomson Reuters has 27,000 employees globally and is valued at around $40 billion on the share market. Thank you so much for coming in today, Steve. Great to see you.
Thanks for having me, Sally. Good to be here.
Now, we've only got 15 minutes, so I'm going to start the clock right now. What time do you get up? What happens? Do you run a marathon in the morning?
I certainly don't run a marathon in the morning. I try to get up somewhere between 5 and 6 a.m., but it does vary depending on which time zone I'm in. So I spend upwards of 50% of my time on the road and quite often in different time zones. And so I do my best to manage around that, but try to get up between 5 and 6 and try to do a workout of some kind.
And do you do the breakfast thing?
I do the breakfast thing, yes. I think it's a very important part of the day. For breakfast tends to be berries, yogurt, and some coffee.
Sounds very healthy. Has there been a project that you were offered, a promotion you were given that changed the trajectory of what you were doing?
Yeah, I mean, I've had a simple sort of philosophy throughout my career. I don't think it was particularly cleverly sort of constructed early on, but I basically used as a North Star the idea that I would take on projects and roles, assignments, lateral, whatever they might be, new jobs, if I felt that they were going to afford me the opportunity to learn more. And that's been the North Star, more so than title, than compensation. And essentially, when you dig beneath that, I tried to get a sense for whether I could learn more from a new set of people than I was learning from those that I happened to be working with. And it sort of simplifies things because it can be very confusing if you think, well, someone offers you, a better compensation level or a big title or, some other sort of interesting entanglement. But I think the sort of learning curve is a really important one.
So has that meant that you have changed companies a lot, or has that meant that you have moved around a lot with your current employer?
Yeah, I haven't changed companies a lot. I worked for PW, as it was known then, PwC for 4.5 years. I then worked for McKinsey for almost 12 years, Nielsen for 8, TPG for 2, and now I've been at Thomson Reuters almost 7. So I think it's very much been a question of sort of assignments, promotions, the chance to work in different markets, different parts of the world, where that sort of learning orientation has been the North Star.
And can you give me an example of a time when you did just that? You accepted a promotion or took on a new role because you were going to learn something new. What were you doing and what did you go and learn? Yeah,
there have been many of those. I mean, I was a partner at McKinsey in New York and thoroughly enjoying the work I was doing there. I was on the partner election committee at McKinsey and really, I think, viewed as sort of part of the furniture there, as someone who'd probably stay for their entire career. And a guy called Dave Calhoun came along, and Dave had spent 27 years at GE under Jack Welch, amongst others, and he had come to be the CEO of Nielsen when 5 private equity firms took Nielsen private. And he approached me and he said, look, I'd like you to leave McKinsey and I'd like you to join Nielsen to help sort of turn around that business. And I said, it sounds interesting to say more. And he said, well, I'm going to teach you how to operate businesses. And he said, you consultants think you can do that, but very few of you can. And if you're prepared to come and put a hard day's work in and learn, I'll teach you how to do that. And I remember going home that night thinking, this is a tough one. I don't want to leave McKinsey, but if one of the world's better operators is prepared to take me under his wing and teach me how to operate businesses, I'm going to learn a lot. And I'm probably going to learn a lot more than I would spending another 3, 4, 5, 10 years in consulting. And so I decided to do it. And it was a great learning experience. Very difficult. I made lots and lots of mistakes. But he showed enough support that when I made a mistake, he would sort of turn it into a learning experience rather than turning it into a really bad moment from which it was difficult to recover.
And do you think if someone had not sort of seen the promise in you and seen your skills, that you might have gone and done that? How important was it that someone was prepared to recognise in you what you couldn't recognise in yourself and take you in a new direction?
It's a great question, Sally. I mean, I think I applaud people who sort of actively manage their careers, folks who have a good sense of the market, a good sense of where they fit and how they would be valued in the external market. I've never really done that. When someone says, what's your career plan? I've never really had one. And I envy people who do. But other than this learning orientation, I've very much sort of done the job in front of me and had my eyes open as to where I might learn more. And I think with that orientation, I've been probably less active about sort of seeking new opportunities and a little bit more passive. And I wouldn't recommend that for talented young people. I think, having a sense for what you're worth in the marketplace and where the opportunities is important. I've probably been a little bit more passive, focused on the job I'm doing and had an assumption or at least a hope that people would see that and see some talent and say, okay, we're going to look for another opportunity for him.
That's interesting. So what do you advise people who are younger than you to have a better sense of themselves and to manage their careers more than you did?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most important thing, which is starting to become, at least in the US, part of the orthodoxy, is you've got to put yourself in situations where you take some career risk and you make some mistakes. I don't go to many conferences, but I was in a conference earlier this year, and the head of HR for one of the world's biggest private equity firms. So she's responsible for sort of hiring, attracting, retaining, developing 200 or 300 CEOs. And, I asked her one-on-one, what are you looking for today that might be different than you were looking for 2 years ago or 3 years ago? And she said, we look for people who've made mistakes.
Yeah, interesting. I love that. Okay, my next question is about career advice. What's the best piece of career advice you've ever received?
Do more listening than talking.
And tell me how you put that into action.
Well, I've always been in sort of versions of client service. I started my career and qualified as a chartered accountant and studied economics. But at the end of the day, I think I'm a salesperson. I enjoy sales. And I think the single most important thing in sales is to do more listening than talking. I think you learn a lot more if you're prepared to just hold your breath for a second or two and let people express their points of view, particularly with clients when you understand the context in which they're operating and the sort of opportunities and threats that they face and their business faces. It makes you better in terms of your ability to respond to that and potentially meet or exceed some of those needs.
And do you find that you have to bite your tongue to do that, or does that come quite naturally?
It can depend on how jet lagged I am. I have to bite my tongue. I consider myself quite an extroverted person, and so happy to lead a conversation where that's appropriate. But I have a sort of a simple rule, which is I'll speak with at least one customer every single day. We have over 600,000 customers at Thomson Reuters, so I can't speak with all of them. But I figure if I have my ear to the ground and I'm listening to at least one customer, and sometimes it's 10 or 20 or 100 customers, I'll learn more from those conversations than I will internally. Internally, organizations tend to sort of become a bit echo chamber-like, and particularly as it pertains to the sort of messages to the chief executive of the board, they can be sanitized, which is not very helpful. Bad news doesn't age well, so the saying goes. And so listening to customers and really understanding what they're up against. And I say to our account people, please, if you're thinking about taking me to one of your customers, take me to the one who's not happy and take me to the one who's sort of struggling with the particular, use of our software or our content, our data, and where perhaps we're not meeting or exceeding the needs of that customer as we aspire to, because we learn more from those interactions and we get better from them.
Steve, stay where you are. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, you get to pick the questions. I'll see you soon. Welcome back to 15 Minutes with the Boss. I'm here with Steve Hasker, the President and Chief Executive of Thomson Reuters. Now, Steve, in front of you is a brown box, somewhat shabby brown box, inside which are about 15 questions. Please pick out them one by one and we'll crack on. What is the biggest career mistake you've made? What happened and how did you recover and what did you learn from it?
I mean, I've made many. When I was in my early days at Pricewaterhouse in Melbourne, I made a very simple error in the context of an audit. And thankfully, I was the one that picked it up. But I remember thinking, okay, you really should not have made that. That was simple. It was just oversight. And I realized it late in the afternoon, and I realized it too late to tell the partner. And it was in the days before mobile phones and the days before email.
Right.
And so I went home and didn't sleep a wink. I mean, I just, tossed and turned and thought, oh my goodness, I'm going to be fired in the morning. This is it. This is the end of my career. And I'll never forget, I went into the partner's office. His name was Tim Dixon. And I knew he got in early. And so I got in very, very early and was there when he arrived. And I knocked on his door and I said, Tim, I've got something to tell you. And I walked in and I said, Tim, I've made a mistake and this is the mistake. And, I can't believe it. And he sort of looked up and over his glasses at me. And I think he pretty quickly realized, he was a good reader of people, and he pretty quickly realized that nothing he could say would administer quite the beating that I had given myself. And he basically said, well, Steve, you won't make that mistake again, will you? And then his next question is, what are you going to do to fix it? And it was a great learning experience because it really said to me, the punishment, if you like, or the way in which you address these kinds of situations just varies greatly depending on the situation. And his ability to read where I was at and what I'd put myself through in an instant, I think was a great lesson for me. And it, in a sense, I learned more from that than if he'd started screaming at me.
So what did you learn from that? Was it about the importance of just being accurate and checking and double checking all the time? What was the actual lesson?
Yeah, I think if I look back at a number of the mistakes I've made over my career, it's been I've made an assumption. So it's commission rather than omission. And I think this is particularly true in an environment where AI is starting to infiltrate more and more of what we do, and particularly young executives, young analysts, young lawyers, young accountants, whichever profession they might be in. The idea that you sort of rely on the AI, there are some prodigious mistakes to be made and that are currently being made by over-relying on AI. And so I think that was an early lesson for me. I mean, not long after that, everybody started using spreadsheets. And there were lots of mistakes to be made there because you'd produce a spreadsheet and rather than actually checking the logic and figuring out that the end result made sense, you'd sort of say, well, it must be. It's in Microsoft Excel. It must be okay. And so I think that was one of the big lessons.
And so just on AI, what does it mean for Thomson Reuters and how are you approaching AI as an organisation?
So AI is a part of everything we're doing, as it should be. I mean, we put a functioning search algorithm on the front of the Westlaw data set in the early 1990s. So in other words, before Google was commercialized, we were in the search business and we were in the AI, or at least the advanced machine learning business. So when ChatGPT passed the bar exam, it was a jolt of energy throughout Thomson Reuters. We'd undergone a 2.5-year transformation program, which I sort of describe as a get fit program ready for tech disruption. And then along came ChatGPT and passed the bar exam. And I think over time will change the way in which most legal work product is produced and most tax and accounting and audit work product is produced. And therefore, for us, in terms of the products that we produce for the marketplace, AI is injected in all of them. And the way we differentiate ourselves is we say we're one of the few companies that can produce fiduciary-grade AI. So in other words, for professions that have to be correct. So, whether you're a practicing attorney or whether you're producing someone's tax return or filing, putting into regulatory filing together, you can't afford to be wrong. And therefore, you can't afford to overly rely on a probabilistic technology. It needs to be deterministic. And so because we have content and expertise, data privacy and protections and customer support, we're able to produce fiduciary-grade AI. And we stand behind those results. So that's the sort of customer-facing side of it. And then internally, we've now for almost 24 months been encouraging our 27,000 people to use as many tools as they can. We provide controlled environments for them internally, but to experiment, to play around with the tools, to do vibe coding where they feel comfortable doing that, to rely upon others in their teams who are doing it, to try to make their work lives more productive, more fun, to get them home at night earlier, and ultimately to enable us to grow faster with about the same resource levels in terms of headcount and token spend and so forth. And I would say, Sally, it's early days in this whole AI journey. I think anyone who tells you they know exactly how it's going to play out and who's going to win and who's going to lose, I think they're full of it. You know, it reminds me of the turn of the century with the advent of the internet in some ways. I think there is a bit of a bubble there in certain aspects of it. There'll be some prodigious winners, there'll be some prodigious losers, and it's not yet clear who those will be. But I'm very confident in the sort of assets that we've had for decades, if not centuries, in terms of our content and our expertise and the importance of those things to producing fiduciary-grade AI. So far, so good.
So I want to come back to tokens. And for our listeners who don't know what tokens are, they are essentially the currency that companies use to pay for their employees' use of AI. And so a lot of companies, I guess, are finding themselves getting bill shock. Have you had bill shock at Thomson Reuters?
Yes. Yeah. We've had bill shock this year in the tens of millions of US dollars over and above our budget, which even for a business of our size is really something. You know, and I had a conversation with the board to say, look, if things go as I think they will, we're going to need to find this year tens of millions of additional dollars in order to cover these costs. But it's a good problem to have because it means our customers are using our products, these agentic products, even more than we expected them to. And we've been able to cover that because we've been driving down costs in non-productive areas wherever we can. But I do think we're moving into an environment where instead of, for example, you know, a head of engineering or a head of software development saying, okay, I'm going to reduce my headcount and increase my token spend. I think we're now at a point where they're saying, hold on, if this token spend continues to grow, I might be better to keep the headcount. And so that's a very different environment than we were in 2 or 3 months ago. And I think it speaks to the fact that things are changing so fast in this AI environment.
That's interesting. So humans might become cheaper than the tokens.
I think in some cases, yes. Yeah. I mean, what we're seeing is a very interesting, I think, sort of finding that's emerging within our software development activities. We've got about 3,500, 4,000 software engineers, and also in other professions, which is the very best of those people are getting the most out of AI. So this idea of a 10x engineer who can turn himself or herself into a 100x engineer, and I think we'll see the same within the professions we serve. So a lawyer who is really good at using the technology can just become significantly more productive and impactful than somebody who's not. And the same for tax and accounting and audit and other professions. And so that's the first thing. But I think the second thing is this idea that, well, the machines are going to be much, much cheaper. So far, that looks to have been partially arbitraged away by the token costs. Yes,
interesting. Okay, what's your pet hate in the office?
I think storytelling for the sake of storytelling. You know, I'll give you an example. I've sat on a couple of boards where, you know, I'm sitting looking at the financial results and I'm listening to the chief executive and I almost think, well, I've opened the wrong board book. The results are not very strong, and yet the chief executive is telling me this fantastic story of growth and profitability and prospect and opportunity when clearly there are issues that need to be discussed and addressed. And so one of the things that I try to do with my team at TR is when we get together, let's talk about what's troubling us. You know, let's take our colleagues' time and get their input and brain power into the parts of the business that we're not happy with and we think need to be really addressed, and we need to problem solve together. And if the results are good enough, those successes will come through those results. And if we continue to focus on problem solving, we will almost ensure that the results continue to be strong. And so one of the things that I really abhor is that sort of corporate storytelling, particularly where it's divorced from the reality of the business.
So that putting gloss over everything when actually there's not so much gloss.
Right.
It's more like red ink.
Yeah. It's very unhelpful. It's very unhelpful, and eventually it becomes toxic.
So how do you balance talking to your team about the need to problem solve, and let's talk about the bad issues, with trying to also motivate them? Because you could just see that could be demotivating if you take it too far.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, I'm sure there are members of my team who would say that Steve doesn't spend enough time. We don't spend enough time as a team celebrating our various successes. And I think that would be a perfectly legitimate criticism. But I suppose, you know, we're always looking to sort of, you know, navigate between being too dire and focusing too much on issues and over celebrating. I would prefer to err toward let's as a team, let's have an orientation and a DNA that's about problem solving, than let's have a DNA that's about celebrating. And so we're probably a little bit further onto that negative side, but I hope it's healthy, and I've certainly got, a highly talented, diverse team who are pretty good at reminding me of things that we're not doing, including celebrating where we need to.
And I've now got one last question, which we ask everybody, and that is, if for some reason you weren't doing your current job, what do you think you would be doing?
I'd like to be a landscape gardener.
Pray tell.
Yeah, I don't have any talent, but I love being outside and sort of digging holes and planting things and watching them grow and pruning and cutting and clipping and raking and all that. For some reason, I like doing those things. I spend a lot of my time in New York City, so I don't have a chance to do much of it, but that's what I would be doing, Sally. Yeah.
Okay, that sounds great. I look forward to coming to one of your glamorous garden designs at some point. And on that note, Steve, thank you so much for allowing us to spend 15 minutes with the boss. Our time is up. Thank you again for coming in.
Thanks, Sally, for having me.
And thank you to everyone for listening. If you like the podcast and you want to hear more, consider sharing the podcast or writing a review, as it helps us to reach more people. And follow us wherever you get your podcasts. At the Financial Review, we investigate the big stories about markets, business and power. For more, go to afr.com. And you can subscribe to the Financial Review, the daily habit of successful people, at afr.com/subscribe. This podcast was hosted by me, Sally Patton, produced by Iona Rennie. Our theme is by Alex Gow, and our executive producer is Fiona Buffini. See you next week.
The Australian Financial Review.